Welcome to In the Author Studio, our conversation number 1 with our guest, Tendayi Viki, and he'll talk about pirates in the Navy. My name's Andrea Kates, and I'm with Future Proofing Next, and my partner in crime, Sean Moffitt, and I run this. This is the first in the series of In the Author Studio, and we're really excited to have Tendayi Viki visiting with us. And just for background, Future Proofing Next, we say is innovation plus plus you can take to the bank. And so the reason that we do these is we're really interested in practical advice around innovation, the future, and business growth. And what we say is that there's a bolder future, and we want to make sure that we can get companies to the next and to a level of growth. And the notion is, are we all ready for a bolder, faster, and simpler future? And we think that today's guest, Tendayi Viki, who wrote a book, Pirates in the Navy, that's coming out soon, so we're right on the early stage of the curve, is a perfect example of practical advice that is based on future needs as well as today, and we think it's perfect for practitioners in corporations. So welcome, Tendayi, and where are you today? What city? What country?
Hey, thank you for having me. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you. It's always cool to actually talk to you, Andrea. I'm in the UK. Yeah, I'm in Canterbury. I live in Canterbury in Kent. I'm originally from Zimbabwe as well, born and raised, and then I moved out here when I was doing my PhD and started a family, 3 boys, and I'm here working.
Oh, that's great. Well, I was saying I'm in San Francisco today, and we are in the middle of, just because people will be listening to this at different times, we're in the middle of the coronavirus lockdown in the Bay Area. So it's really wonderful to have a chance to do things like this and reach out to peers and really connect about what's going to be today and tomorrow really important for companies and business and innovators within them. So the first thing I want to say is that I loved your book, and I'm not saying that because you're on the program, but I really thought that there were 3 things that were great about it. Number 1, it is news that everyone can use. There's a tone to it that is a combination of well-researched and well-informed, as well as a lot of new twists. So to me, it's the kind of book that you can roll your sleeves up and get started with, but also maybe call Tendayi and say, need a little clarification here, what's the process for this? So that's the first. I think the second is that there's a sense of humor about it. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The tone has a sense of, approachability. And I think the third is that it's for tomorrow's issues. So whereas innovation has a lot of things that now we're very used to, some of them are even cliches like innovation theater and, the notion that you should be generating a lot of ideas. This is really looking at the issues for today. What is it that an intrapreneur within a corporation needs to do, needs to know to succeed, because we're at a new level of maturation in innovation in corporations. So address that back. What are your thoughts? Why'd you write the book? What are your reactions to the way that we just framed that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, I do have a slightly relaxed tone, just generally as a person. So I'm happy when people say that comes through when I'm doing my writing. It's something that I sort of try to accomplish, to try not to be too pretentious. So, but also I agree with you completely in the sense that a lot of the arguments about innovation and disruption have been won. Like, it's now rare to run into that. Like that's a rare executive that you run into that will say, we don't need to innovate anymore. We don't need to come up with disruptive ideas. We don't need to create new ideas anymore. So in the sense that now that the argument is won, the question on deck becomes, well, okay, show us the goods. How do we do it now? How do we implement it? How do we roll it out? How do we make it work? We know that startups are successful and startups are doing really well, but we're a large company. We have a core business to run. So show us how to actually do it in the sense that we don't have to stop working on our core business, but we can build these 2 almost divergent cultures to coexist within one institution. So how does that work? And so that's where we are now. And that's the work that Pirates in the Navy attempts to do.
Well, so let's get to the punchline. I really love the way you end the book. And the punchline of the book is this notion that not all pirates are the same, that there are differences. Yeah. And I thought that was, first of all, historically pretty interesting. because I love to read about pirates. But also, could you define a little bit the differences between a privateer and a pirate, and what the punchline is to the book, in case people only watch or listen to the first part of this?
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? Because it was Steve Jobs, right, who first said it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy, and then he did like the whole pirate flag thing for the Mac team. But actually, and he was making the distinction between large companies and startups, right? It's better to be a startup than to join a large company. But once large companies accept that they need to innovate, then you have to be a pirate in the Navy. And so once you become a pirate in the Navy, the question becomes, if you're an entrepreneur and an innovator, how do you navigate that context? And most of the conversations that have been happening for the last maybe 2-3 years, maybe even 5 years, sort of going back, have sort of tried to pitch the entrepreneur in an antagonistic way, in an antagonistic fashion to the company that they work for. And so this book, The Pirates in the Navy, is about stopping entrepreneurs from thinking that way. Like, you cannot view the company that you work for in an antagonistic way, right? And so not all pirates are the same. Is this attempt to make a distinction between, because entrepreneurs are told, or intrapreneurs are told to be like pirates, right? Let's make this distinction between a pirate who's just a criminal, basically, somebody who rolls life fees. They're unattached to any institution. They're robbing people. They can never land on any piece of land except maybe abandoned islands. So the only places where they can stop, right? Because if they're ever caught, they'll be made to walk the plank, or they'll be killed. Which is what happens with rogue ideas inside large companies. If you're working on a rogue idea that's unconnected to anything that's interesting for leadership, people will, but once they find your idea, will make their best attempts to get it killed. Now, a privateer is a pirate, for sure, but they're a pirate that is attached to a specific institution. So Francis Drake, for example, was a privateer for Elizabeth I. And the role of the privateer is to be a pirate on the high seas, but their job is to raid and loot the ships of enemy countries. So when they come back from doing their work, if you want to call it work, there's somebody in the institution that's willing to absorb that and accept it and celebrate it and sort of take it to scale, if you want to say. So what I always say to entrepreneurs is the best way to be a pirate in the Navy is to build a bridge between the innovation work that you're doing and the core business and the mothership and the leadership that is running the main organization.
So it's interesting because we'll also talk about scale a little bit. There's certain moments where people fan the flames of new ideas and you don't want to be on the radar. Actually, I feel like we should be doing this interview with like patches on our eyes and the plank, and because it's a really great set of images that we have historically about people who have the bravery to go out and seek new lands. But as you said, I really love the notion of privateers, where there's this sense of being accepted, supported, maybe even funded by the quote mothership. And I think that it's, as you said, easier said than done in a lot of ways. And I think you have a lot of practical ideas about how that could happen. So I'm interested in something that you say in the book also, that is, hold on. There's a great quote. Not only is it the notion of how you get the commission, but there's also this idea that you say that, are these the differences between a privateer and a pirate?
Oh yeah, you can see my pirate is wearing a suit and tie there at the end, my privateer.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of pirates with suits and ties, so this is very, very relatable. But this is from your book, and I think that it's interesting that you give us these mental images to maybe inspire us. Anything you want to say about the sketch before we move on?
Yeah, so I work with Holger Dilspol, who's part of the Strategizer ecosystem, right, with this, and he did all the images. He's an innovation coach himself, so it kind of made sense to collaborate with him. And so the imagery is just really to kind of, I think visuals help land the message, right? They create like a memory bank of things that you can use to then kind of relate to the content, right? So yeah, that's why we work together on this. Yeah.
Well, so let me ask another question. Moving to this topic of, you outlined really well that, and I loved your quote, organizational structures can overpower human capabilities, and the idea that there are some very big challenges for people trying to do something, because even though there might be privateers, somebody has to get that boat and get the sextant and the maps and chart a new course, basically. And so there are ways that these organizational structures can, I love this notion of overpowering human capabilities. Can you talk more about some of the elements of that and what the dynamic is for what happens to people who have been placed in this kind of not enviable position of saying, okay, why don't you figure it out?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? Because one of the things that people tend to ignore when they're trying to change culture is the organizational structures inside an organization. They tend to treat culture like it's some sort of positive vibe that comes down from the mountains to bless the people, you know. Let's get like hackathons going, let's get like a lab. And then like as we're hanging out, you know, the culture will change. But actually, if you don't change the institutional structures, if you do a hackathon, if there's a winner, the winning idea has just won a chance to write a 35-page business plan that will then go to another leader who will look at it and then say the numbers don't make sense. So like the moment you're done with your fun stuff and now you want to try to implement something, the structure just overpowers any human capability that you have. And so the way to become a pirate in the Navy is what we're trying to do. We're trying to institutionalize innovation. We're trying to make innovation a legitimate part of the structures. So such that when people try to innovate, they bump up against structures that sort of put wind in their sails rather than something that sort of tries to anchor them to the ground, right? And so this is Clayton Christensen who said this, there's no chance that any group of individuals can ever overpower the pre-existing organizational structure, right? You have to actually do the work of shaping and evolving that structure so that it becomes more supportive of the individuals that are trying to innovate.
Well, I have a question, and it's implicit but not explicit in the book. So let's imagine that there's a person who starts out with the tie, right? And then they incrementally develop some new lines of business. This has been going on for years and decades, et cetera. Do you get to the same place? So if you've got this privateer that's kind of charged with, okay, figure out how this works or how we might change our business model or how we might take advantage of a new technology, buzzword of the day that everyone's curious about, or people within lines of business that are just said, you know, grow 10% next year, figure that out. Do they end up in different places?
Yeah, they end up in different places.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, so incremental innovation, which is the person who's got a tie, who figures out to like grow 10% the following year, maybe launch something really cool in the current market or improve current capabilities, and right, they don't get to the same place. And it's simply because of the speed of change. So the world is changing so quickly that if you use the existing structures, you're going to get caught out, right? You're going to get caught out. I mean, just think about it. This is absolutely true. I have no evidence to prove it, but I'm convinced this is true, that in Kodak, there was a guy with a suit and tie who had been raising revenue 10% every year. In Blockbuster, there was a guy with a suit and tie who was raising revenue 10% every year. I'm absolutely convinced that during the week that Kodak went bankrupt, there was an HR manager who made a decision to give someone a bonus because they had hit their goals for the previous year. And then like 6 days later, the company is actually bankrupt. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build inside our companies this ability to create net new growth. Net new growth is like new business models, new products and ideas that we've never had before inside our company. The most extreme example would be, you know, Amazon, the book selling website, and Amazon Web Services, and then Alexa. You know, that kind of like dynamic of like, you know, you can't, there's no way that the guy in the suit and the tie doing books will get to Alexa by doing incremental investments of growing 10% a year. They just will never get to the same place.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I have another question about the way you were talking a little bit about gaining legitimacy and the mistakes that entrepreneurs make, and intrapreneurs, you know, entrepreneurs within large companies. It's easier said than done. And people in the Future Proofing Next community love specific examples without, you know, anything proprietary. Has there been somebody who's inspired you in terms of really figuring out how to gain that legitimacy? Because you talk about maybe it's not the beanbag chairs that are going to help you gain legitimacy. Maybe it's not an early win of, you know, an A/B test that looks really great from a lean startup perspective, but how is that ever going to scale? You know, how do you actually do that? Do you have a story perhaps of someone who's done it well, who could inspire us?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? Because every entrepreneur that I meet who's at the beginning of their movement has a PowerPoint deck, and they're walking around the organization going on an innovation political campaign. They're showing leaders all these slides. Look at Amazon, look at Facebook, look at, and no matter what example you show leaders, they can always tell you, yeah, but we're a different company, that would never work. Right? And so I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with that because they just don't have the legitimacy. And so the best way to get legitimacy, right, is to get an early win within that company. You cannot get legitimacy without getting an early win. You have to do something innovation related that succeeded inside the company. There's a really great story in scale, I think it's called Scaling Excellence or something like that, the book. Yeah, it's called Scaling Excellence. That's the name of the book, yes. Fantastic book. And the guy who wrote the book gives this example of, I think her name was Claudia Kochka. She was working for P&G. And she was able to scale design thinking inside P&G, but she started off by working on an existing brand, Mr. Clean, and applying those principles and practices and helping like revive that brand and kind of make that successful. And then once you do that, they're like, oh yeah, I remember Claudia, she's the one that helped us do X. And now those stories. So we say the way to get legitimacy is to get an early win and then celebrate like crazy, like tell the story to the organization. Like get an early win, celebrate like crazy, that gets you legitimacy. Then you don't have to walk around with a PowerPoint deck. You can walk around with actual stories of actual achievements that you've had inside the organization, right? It's a really important sort of practice.
Mm. Well, you know, it's interesting too, because the idea of not just walking around with a deck, but walking around with a win, there's something that's related to that that's in your book that I think we should say explicitly right now, which is an early win within a company. You know, we talk a lot about customer discovery, you know, especially in lean startup land, and, you know, being able to do things in that way at a smaller scale. But the components of what will resonate within a large company X, like P&G, versus large company Y, even like a Unilever, might also be different. So you have to, it sounds like, you know, what you say in your book is you have to kind of know your internal stakeholders. Like, you know, the queen might care about jewels or riches or relationships with certain geographies, right? So you have to know what the value proposition is of your internal stakeholders, because somebody could have said, oh, the Mr. Clean brand, who cares about that? So there was something that is actually part of your story that sounds like good advice for people. What are your thoughts about that? Understanding the value propositions, the dimensions of what it takes to gain legitimacy is not a small thing, it sounds like.
No, it's not a small thing. So let me just hit you with a series of questions that entrepreneurs get, right? That tell you, like, you need to understand your environment. So you'll be doing your political campaign with your deck with Amazon and Facebook and everything. And then they'll go, oh yeah, that's really interesting. Where have you ever seen that work? And they'll go, yeah, no, it's worked at Amazon, and it's worked at Facebook, and it's worked at, I don't know, some other company, Unilever. And then they go, okay, great. Have you ever done it? And then you go, if you're lucky enough to have been a startup founder, you can say, yeah, I worked in a startup and we ran experiments, whatever. And then they go, oh, okay, great. Have you ever seen it work here? All right. And that's the question that that kills you. And then maybe you have a story. I don't know. You can go, yeah, sure. There's a person, and then they go, have you ever done it here? Mm. And that's like an assassin's bullet, right? They're not getting up from that. Because if you've never done it, then they're looking for an opportunity to dismiss you. And by the way, I believe that leaders are legitimate in asking these questions, because no matter how cool you are, you're not the first consultant that's come through the board telling them that you're going to help them innovate. You're just not. They've heard it several times and they've seen it all bomb. They're just tired of it now. And so it's better to walk around with an early win than walk around with a PowerPoint deck, like you're saying. And I used to be one of those entrepreneurs that was always excited when a company gave me a chance to do something, anything, a hackathon, a lab, whatever it was. I didn't care. I just wanted to take that chance. But I actually found out that it's better to begin with discovery. It's better to try and understand your company a little bit more so that your work becomes relevant. So if you can't get an early win inside a large organization if you're working on something that's not relevant to the company. You have to pick something that's relevant and something that they would celebrate if it turned out to be successful. And so the best way to gain legitimacy is to begin with discovery and then help leaders accomplish the things that are keeping them up at night by applying these innovation methodologies. And then that buys you the opportunity to kind of move to the next level.
Well, that's interesting because it also talks a little bit about this notion of working with the early adopters. So if it sounds like it would be really hard to move an entire naval ship all in one direction, unless you have a couple of people on the naval crew or the mothership, I guess, already bought in. Is there something special about which early adopters you would want to work with?
Yeah, so what's interesting about this, right, is that as much as large companies are difficult places to work, inside every organization I've worked with, there's a group of leaders that get it. There's always one or two leaders that really get it, right? That want to use innovation to do projects, that have probably tried to run projects on their own and they've been struggling with it and they would really need support to scale one or two things that they're actually working on. And so the role of doing discovery is to start, finding these early adopters. And we often say to innovation teams or startups, when you're launching your products, don't launch it big bang to the whole world. Start with early adopters. That's where you launch your minimum viable product. That's where you do your testing. That's where you do your iterations. That's what we say to sort of startup teams. So the same principle just applies here, which is identify those leaders inside your organization that have been wanting to innovate for a long time and are struggling with it, and bring this toolbox to them. The agreement that I always say that an entrepreneur should have with their early adopters is, number one, we're going to apply lean startup design thinking, all these great modern innovation methodologies. They have to accept that as part of the deal. And then the second part of the deal is, if we're successful, you have to let us tell the story to the rest of the organization. Yeah. Those are the two agreements that you need to have, right? Because you need to illustrate that the methodologies work, and then you need to show that they can work successfully within the context of that company, right? And I think that's the best way to select your early adopters.
Well, it brings me to the next question, which is about scale. And I have a whole theory on this, which is, I used to say like 1, 2, 3, a million, so you have to go incrementally to a certain point, but then some people call it liftoff, some people call it scale, some people call it, there are many things, but it's not like it's not like you can keep doing things in a linear additive fashion. There's a moment where you have to achieve escape velocity. So, what are your senses about what really works there? Because there's an element, it sounds like, in the book of, you say assess where you are as a company, assess your business environment, identify key gaps, and define strategic guidance. I wonder if you could pick one of those, or the ones that you think are really important in terms of really getting to this scale, because it's an art and a science, it sounds like, from Pirates in the Navy.
Yeah, it's art and a science. And there's a part of it as well, like in Pirates in the Navy, where I say, when innovators get their early win inside a large company, they become like mini rock stars sometimes. So he launched the new banking app, got us 3 million new customers and $7 million in new revenues, whatever. So now they're being rolled up all over the company. They're being taken around, and everybody's showing them around, and they're being asked to judge hackathons now and speak to the board. And then they get. So my thing is, don't get too cozy in the early win, because you still haven't changed the organizational structures, right? It's really important to change the organizational structures. So the conversation that I have with loads of large companies is, think about like, what are the mechanics you need to scale an innovation movement inside your organization? Right? What are the things that you need to have in place? And use the early win to put in place those changes. Set up innovation boards. Make sure that you have a clearly defined innovation strategy, because when you have a clearly defined innovation strategy, it gives innovators the canvas in which they know that their ideas are going to be accepted, right? So teams know this, right? And the way you get to having a really great innovation strategy is to work with leadership to assess the business environment, what key trends out there in the world are coming towards us that we need to respond to. And then, okay, those key trends are coming towards us. How are we as a company? How responsive is our current business model to those things that are coming towards us? What are the gaps between where the world is going and who we are? And then use those gaps to define the places where teams can play and sort of generate new ideas. And with those agreements in place, that's one big part of the ecosystem, right? Having a clear strategical, with those agreements in place, innovation teams can then work on ideas that are connected to where the company is trying to get to, which then allows, those ideas to be able to be taken to scale if they ever become successful.
That's really helpful. So at the end of these, we have two things that we do. One is that we're going to show some of the excerpts from your book, and we're really lucky because you have, if I can, you have great illustrations. So anything you want to say is kind of an explanation of any of these. I'll just do a few in a row.
That's innovation theater.
and so, yeah, tell us more about that. This is what we talked about being kind of a cliche. Yeah.
It's a bit cliche now, but it's a whole conversation we've been having for the last couple of years about innovation teams that just do like all the cool stuff around innovation, but don't create any value. So sticky notes, labs. So they're not really creating net new growth, which is the whole point around innovation.
Okay, and this one?
This one is about starting small and not going big bang, right? So when you're doing innovation, start small, start with early adopters. Don't just go like for the big win. I see a lot of entrepreneurs try and take on the whole organization at once, and you're just never going to win. I've never seen an innovator that succeeded at taking on the whole institution at once.
And
get an early win. That's what get an early win, and
the last one is.
And then scale your movement, right? On the basis of that early win, you can start to then.
So is this a pirate climbing a mountain? Have we just like switched metaphors here?
I know, right? It's like
I love it.
I love that.
We go from the water to the mountains. No, it's great.
I didn't know, like maybe like right the crest of the wave. That would have been
yeah. Either way, yeah. No, I think it's great.
That would have been a better metaphor. Yeah.
I'm just teasing. So before we go into we have this in the author's studio list of questions that we like to do rapid fire at the end. Is there anything you'd like to say? I'll give you a little bit of summary of what I've learned so far. So I love the language that you used, criminal, rogue, privateer, because it takes the notion of pirate, which is literally just like, a parrot on your shoulder and a patch on your eye and a peg leg. And it gives it a lot more nuance. And I think it's a lot more, relatable in some ways, even though it's still pirate language. And I also really love the notion that the pirates in the Navy approaches today's issues. Today's issues are less about finding ideas or being innovative or figuring out how to do design thinking or figuring out open innovation. Those are very important disciplines, but this takes it to that next level, which is to really achieve scale and traction within an organization. There is, I liked how you said you don't want to be a criminal, so criminals are cast out and put behind bars, but privateers are part of the infrastructure. And so I really take that as a really important takeaway. What takeaway would you like to leave us with before we do the in the author's studio quick hits?
No, I think that's it. I think you've got it right on the money. But the thing that I really care about is, I just call it breach to the core, breach to the core. I keep just referring to that breach to the core notion. And it is basically this idea that you don't view the company that you work for in an antagonistic fashion, right? There's actually legitimate reasons that leaders resist innovation. You don't work in a company full of idiots, right? I always say this to entrepreneurs. You're not Elon Musk and you don't work in a company full of idiots. If you don't take anything else from the book, at least take that away, because that humility and authenticity will get you a really, really long way. It's hard enough to do innovation inside large organizations without having a group of people that are actively rooting for you to fail, because you're just such a brash character and you're difficult to work with. You're like, I'm going to save you all from disruption, right? And so we're trying to kind of just contain that and build a culture where people that are working on the core business and people that are working on innovation actively collaborate, because the ultimate goal is the same, right? To have these companies that last for generations and create more value within society. Yeah.
So important. Well, here we go with the final part of this. It is our new tradition that starts today called In the Author's Studio. We call this the Author's Dozen. So I'll just throw them really fast at you. They go right through the screen. This is just in general. We're trying to develop with all the authors and all the thought leaders what's going on, because we're interested in future proofing. So we like to take the pulse around the world right now. So what do you think's overhyped right now in general? And it could be anything from the news and business, anything. What's overhyped?
Technology.
What is?
Technology.
Okay.
We're overhyping the value of technology, AI.
What's underhyped?
Business models, the value of business models, matching technologies with business models.
Great. What's your favorite quote?
So my favorite quote was something I saw last week, which said, "That mountain that you're carrying, you were only supposed to climb it." I don't know who said that. I think that's really
great.
cool.
I love it.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite statistic, real or imagined, right now that you like that appeals to you?
Yeah, I like one of my favorite statistics right now is that even for venture capital, over 60% of ideas, over 60% of investments fail, right? And so the ones that succeed are just like a third, maybe sometimes even less than that. And so if a venture capitalist fails two out of three times, then leaders need to accept that they can't pick the winning ideas themselves on day one. They have to create the context in which winning ideas emerge.
So other than Sean Moffat and Andrea Kates, who would you invite over to your Changemakers Last Supper?
Last Supper, Steve Blank. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. If you were 23 again, given what you know now, what would you be doing?
If I was 23, I would have moved to Palo Alto.
Ah, there you go. Welcome. That would be great. When's the last time you were blindsided by a shift in your market? I know you've got experience in business and in life. When's the last time you were blindsided?
So a couple of things. When I was an academic, there was a huge shift in education, right, away from like just textbooks to technology. That kind of blindsided us because as academics, you always think that you're gonna write a book, like a textbook, and then you're gonna become famous, So that kind of blindsided me. And then what's happened now has really blindsided me, right? This crisis we're in just took me completely by surprise. When it emerged in China, I never thought that I would spend the rest of the year sitting in my house, right? It was, it's been a big shock, and just the level of tragedy and that's just happening around the world. Yeah, that's really taken me
incredible.
Out a little bit.
Yeah. Which companies do you admire today that we've heard of?
Amazon.
And which companies do you admire today that we've never heard of?
So I don't know whether people have heard of Ping An, right? The Chinese insurance company. I really admire Ping An. They're really great at like building new businesses, like net new businesses on top of their existing business models. So powerful, really great Chinese company, Ping An.
How would you like other people to describe you when it comes to your role as a change maker and impact maker?
You know how they call like certain coaches in the NFL quarterback whisperers? I like to be known as like the intrapreneurs whisperer.
We'll do that in our write-up. The Intrapreneurs Whisperer is great. Which technology or emerging innovation intrigues you right now?
Given my first statement.
Since it's overhyped.
Given my first statement, I don't think technology is that important, by the way. I think a lot of breakthrough happens. I think technology enables new ways of thinking about business models, right? Because without certain technologies, you could never think about different ways of doing things. So I'm really interested in like machine learning. I think that really intrigues me, right? Because that like takes you to like, it's just how do you even design business models around something that learns and can take you in different, and how do you learn from its learning to inform designs that you're making, right? So it's pretty cool.
And what do you do for fun?
I play basketball with my kids.
Yes.
Although Alex also older says they make me look older than I really am.
Well, I'll do a formal pitch in terms of the book Pirates in the Navy. Anything else you want to talk about? When does it come out officially? Thank you, by the way, for giving us an advance copy. May 15th?
May 15th.
And it was already our book of the month last month, not realizing that it wasn't available to the public. So Future Proofing Next already I picked you as book of the month. You can list that on your promotion now. And
Well, you know, you're future proofing, right? So it doesn't have to
yeah,
be out.
that's right. That's right. We have a book from the future. For people who want
Yeah,
the deck,
exactly.
we'll be happy to send the impressive bio to anybody who requests the deck. And once again, we are future proofing next. And this was in the author's studio. And we talk about, you know, are you ready for a bolder, faster, and simpler future? So I'd like to thank Tendayi. This was awesome. You get to say one thing that was an aha, an insight, or something fun about the time we just spent together, and then we'll close out.
No, thank you very much. I mean, you know, the biggest aha was, you know, the way you described the book, the statements you made about the book, the first ones about it being about what's coming in innovation rather than what's happening now, the simplicity of the language, the applicability. Yeah, those were aha moments. Like I never really explicitly thought about it that way. So just thank you for like raising that and making it conscious. I'm going to say that every time. I'm going to quote you.
Wonderful. That's great. And just put a little royalty of $1 every time and we'll be
Okay,
fine.
cool.
Yeah, like the
That's
prize.
all good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I'll
it
get
was
you a cup of coffee.
exactly. That's right. Well, it was awesome to engage with you again. I hope I get to see you physically again soon in some city where we overlap. And thank you for being our first conversation on In the Author Studio.
Thank you, Andrea. It was really fun. Thank you.